and welcome to the Pop Culture Show, where we dig into the crossroads of the occult and popular culture. We are your hosts, Jason Winslade and Lilith Dorsey, and we are here today to talk about witches. Go figure. We are we are looking at, actually, this is the first time we're kind of looking at a book, even though it is about the stuff that we talk about. And if you don't mind all the post-it notes, this is my friend and former colleague, Jane Barnette, Dr. Jane Barnette of University of Kansas, with the book Witch Fulfillment, Adaptation, Dramaturgy, and Casting the Witch for Stage and Screen. And Jane will be joining us in just a minute to discuss this new work. And yeah, I mean, we are all about witches on stage and screen, are we not?
Oh, of course. And it was such a treat to be able to look at this book. I feel like we've touched on some of these themes and we'll get into more depth with this when she comes on. But I feel like this is what we do, right? Like as academics, we write about it, we analyze it, we sort of come up with new ways of thinking about it. And I thought that there were a lot of really innovative ways of thinking about things in this book. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and Jane and I go way back. Well, I'm sure that some history will be told, and it's funny because we actually, the three of us have a connection in an interesting way. We'll get to that. So we are back with my friend and former colleague Jane Barnette. I keep on saying your name and then saying your name again with Doctor, but Dr. Jane Barnette of University of Kansas. And we have her book here, and I'm going to read her bio. Jane Barnette is the head of dramaturgy and associate professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Kansas, where she teaches courses in dramaturgy, theater history, and script analysis, as well as seminars on theatrical adaptation and the performance of gender and sexuality. Barnette's research includes feminist adaptations, student-centered pedagogy, and depictions of witchy characters on stage and in popular culture. And as you might imagine, that last part is why we are talking to Barnette today, because we are all about the witchy on stage and screen. So welcome, Jane. Great to see you.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So yeah, we Jane and I go way back. Um, it's funny because I don't remember exactly where we met, but we were both grad students. You at UT Austin and me at Northwestern, and somehow we found each other and we're like, hey, we're both into spooky witchy things. Let's do a thing. And
Yep.
we did a panel at San Antonio at the ATHA conference, the American Theater American Association of Theater Higher Education.
Yeah.
So long, I've forgotten. The ATHA
Yep.
conference in San Antonio in 1997. The
Yep.
Wiccan performativity panel, when we put those two words together, and we didn't really I don't think know what they meant at the time.
No.
And so the connection here is that Lilith and I first collaborated at an ATHA conference 10 years later
What?
in New Orleans in 2007. So
Man, I'm sorry I missed that. Wow.
we did a ritual, we did a panel. It was just after Katrina. It was like maybe a year or two after
Uh,
Katrina.
wow.
It was intense.
I bet.
You would
I
have
bet.
loved it. You would have
I
loved
think I
it.
would
My
have.
favorite, I'm still telling the story about my favorite part was one of the people in our ritual was doing interpretive dance and they went like this backwards, screaming, crashed into the wall and fell face down at the feet of my good friend Kane, who had just walked in the door to help us with the ritual. So it was hilarious. Like I just love it.
I
It
was
was
drumming.
fantastic.
It was a whole thing. So yeah, we have this ATHA connection between the three of us, interestingly enough. Um, so yeah. So this book just came out, Witch Fulfillment, with my
You
uh,
have notes. I love it.
yes, adaptation, dramaturgy, and casting the witch for stage and screen. This just came out from Rutledge.
Hi.
You've got the coveted Rutledge publication. that all of us theater and performance studies scholars, strive for. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So let's turn back time a little bit and talk about how you started to incorporate the interest in witchcraft into your theater studies.
Yes. Well, and I talk a little bit about this in the introduction, I think, but you know, so at the University of Kansas, when I first came to Kansas, I had to sort of start over in terms of the tenure track. So that was super duper fun. But once I got past that hump again, I decided that why was I doing all of this work if it wasn't going to come with some kind of power? And the power that I wanted to use was the power to sort of speak my mind and say what I really have always wanted to write about, which is witches. The jokes just make themselves. But I had directed Sycorax. It was the regional premiere of that show, and that's the image from the cover. There is Alicia Griffin, who played the role, the starring role there, and that experience was incredible. But I had also been so before I got into theater history, I was a makeup artist. And Lilith, I have noticed that you have amazing makeup taste, so maybe you can understand this, like this sort of lifelong fascination with how makeup can change a person's face. And I started thinking about the kind of makeup that got used with witch characters on stage. And so for a little while, I was sort of moving the project ahead as witch face, thinking about the sort of ways that makeup enabled a sense of witchiness, right? And this, I kept going down this road for some time before it really started to click into glamour magic and drag and sort of a wider appreciation of the power of makeup to be a kind of magical transformation. And at first I thought that was going to be the direction, but as it turns out, and this is probably not surprising to y'all, but it was something that was quite difficult to encounter, which was that so many of the contemporary plays that I was watching featured characters that were witches or not witches, that were called witches but didn't call themselves witches. But in any case, they weren't wearing any makeup at all. And it was frustrating. But then I also started to re-center myself in terms of what is this inquiry really about, and I became more passionate about I think it's pretty clear in the introduction as well. I feel very passionately that witches are a category of theatrical representation that is not yet understood in a way that we have begun to understand, and we still have a lot of work to do, but we've begun to understand some other types, right? So for example, the stage Jew, there's an understanding about what would be a caricature and what might be something more authentic. And the need, for example, if you're going to put on Paula Vogel's Indecent, it might be smart to work with some actual Jewish people on that production. But I didn't see any kind of reciprocal kinds of consideration for witches, right? So people were putting all sorts of different performances on stage with nary a witch in sight. And, in some cases I knew this because I talked to the actual people making the show, but in other cases I was just in the audience and I could just tell because of the stereotypes, because of the ways that that they understood or seemed to understand witchcraft. So that's where it stemmed from, was a desire to take some of the same skills that I have been using in other formats in terms of adaptation dramaturgy, and to focus it in the character of the theatrical witch or the stage witch, and also the screen witch. So
just as a sidebar for those of us those of you watching who don't know what dramaturgy is, can you explain? Because I also love the fact in the book that you connect it with thaumaturgy.
yes.
And there's also theurgy. There's all these urgies that are somehow connected. So yeah, how does dramaturgy play into this play?
Yeah. See, the jokes, they keep coming.
Right.
Dramaturgy is one of those notoriously slippery terms and roles. But my sort of favorite way of defining it has to do with that that person who asks the difficult questions in the room. So yes, when I work as a dramaturg, I do a lot of research. But the research, number one, the research I do is not always textual. It's often it's music based, it's image based. But number two, I think the value that I add to the production is strongest when the director wants me in the rehearsal room and the actors and the designers get to ask questions, or rather, in some cases, I get to ask them questions. But it's basically a sort of a role that is adjacent to the director in a production setting where I, am trying to help the director achieve whatever concept they have. In a new play setting, I'm trying to help the playwright achieve whatever it is that they're trying to get at. And my area of expertise is adaptation dramaturgy. So I'm really looking at both of those things. I'm thinking about what is the source from which this is adapted, and therefore sort of what is the original playwright, if you will, but also what is it that we're doing with this, and why does it matter now? Why do this particular adaptation as theater now?
That's great. I really think you are the perfect guest. We just shot a show with Michael Herkes about the magical power of makeup. That's what his new book is about. So
I can't wait
and
to see
I do
that
have my
episode.
blue eyeshadow on today because I am a witch. So I was like, that's in the book. You have
Nice.
to have the witchy blue eyeshadow.
That's right.
That kind of a thing, right? No, but it's so fascinating to me, this concept. I know you talk a little bit about my friend Pam Grossman, Waking the Witch and all of that, and how she talks about this kind of glamour being associated both with, the beauty of it and the makeup industry, and also with a witch's glamour, right? Transforming ourselves into something else. And I find it so fascinating that you write about, not just the makeup and the theatricality of some of these productions, but also the absence of it, which I found fascinating. So thank you for that. I don't know if there's a question in there, but thank you.
Yeah, and you mentioned Pam Grossman, whose name, it's almost embarrassing how many times it shows up in there. But I've been teaching a class called Witches in Popular Culture for the last several years, and for the first iterations of that class, her book, Waking the Witch, was the textbook for the class. No offense to Pam, but probably moving forward, it'll be my book. But that being said, she really has inspired, and as you well know, an entire generation of witches coming up.
Yeah, most certainly. Most certainly. I love that. And you also mentioned another good friend of ours, Heather Green, who we talked about on some of our earlier episodes. She's actually my editor. So I have much love for Heather Green.
Yes. I have a
Definitely.
love-hate relationship, right? Because when her most recent book came out, I was like, dang it, it came out so soon. But it was, as you well know, much more focused on screen, and certainly much more comprehensive. My book doesn't even pretend to be as comprehensive. But her work is extraordinary, and her social media presence as well is really something to admire in terms of keeping those images front and center. And I think, before we started recording, Lilith, I was telling you about having your book and the signed copy of it, and really finding so much of what you have done also instructive as I was trying to pull all of my research together. So
Thank you. It's hard. It's hard because so many times we find these people that are, either academics or spiritual practitioners, and there's very few of us that sort of bridge the gap. And I appreciate that a lot, definitely. I love the way you have it laid out too, kind of like a circle casting, right? And we're moving through the elements, we're moving through the directions, we're sort of associating how you're presenting this and how it's unfolding, like the casting of a circle and a magical ritual. And I think that's so important because, again, people that are clearly academics miss that part. Like, so when did you decide that that was going to be your decision for how you're putting it together?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I was hoping we could talk a little bit about this. I find it to be one of the more interesting parts of the sort of origin narrative. I found that I could not write this book the way that I wrote my previous book. This book really needed to write me. And so I would say about a year into the solid work on writing, I kept hitting all sorts of blocks, and none of the regular tricks that I would use as a writer, as an academic, would work. And it's basically exactly what you said. It just sort of dawned on me as the sort of most obvious and yet most obscure thing for an academic to consider, which was, hey, maybe, just maybe, you need to come at this not as an academic, but what if you came at this as a witch? What if you actually, like, sat with yourself, started meditating again, started doing some ritual again, and then you can see if it starts to flow. And the chapters, this probably won't surprise either one of you, but the two chapters that insisted the most on that were the Medea chapters and the Sycorax and Tituba. Those two chapters wouldn't go anywhere. And I mean, frankly, the Weird Sisters chapter also gave me all sorts of grief. But that was a little bit different. That was a lack of understanding in terms of their element, and when that popped into place, it was much clearer. And so yeah, it was a little bit organic insofar as once I started to regularly cast a circle before I would try to write for the book, it sort of became that much more obvious to me that there were certain characters who were really aligned with certain elements, and other characters who were, as I said, I was thinking of them in the wrong way. So I had been thinking of, for example, I had been thinking about the Weird Sisters, not in terms of West or water, but in terms of questions first of fire and then of earth. I think I was just sort of casting around. I wasn't quite sure casting, but yeah.
What's interesting about that is that it's the most witchy part of it, but yet at the same time, it immediately, for me in our shared history, it evoked our performance studies past, because we loved to put our academic work in this ritual frame, and I think we did that for the presentation. I think we did that where I think we cast a circle in like used academic language, and like we were like calling ourselves academicians or something like that. I don't know.
Yes, we did.
But yeah, so the idea of putting those ideas within a ritual framework is very performance studies, and I totally love that about the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm still at that. I don't know if you can sort of dig it, but I'm at the stage where I'm just like, I wonder if folks are gonna read it. When you put something out in the world, you just don't know. And especially in this case, because it really did feel like a kind of coming out on several levels, right? So Jason's not wrong. We certainly did have that moment in Atha, but I mean, Jason, you can confirm this. I didn't really do much in the field that had to do directly with witchcraft for a long time. And I was also in a very conservative part of the country for a while. Sure. So, yeah.
And I just remember, like, when we did that panel, I remember the response, because we were both so open about it. The response from other academics were like, "Ooh, I'm secretly this too, but I can't really be out and open." So this is also, I mean, part of the courage of this book is that you are out and open about these associations and don't apologize for them. So that, I think that's just as an academic book, I think that's especially in this field, is somewhat groundbreaking. So yeah,
thank you. It's scary, but it felt like the right choice. And also, frankly, Medea and Tituba, they're not going to be in a book with someone who's being like, I don't know. They very much don't want to hang out with folks who aren't sure that they want to engage with magic. At least that was my experience. So
yeah, the framework of the book, I think it starts off with the question: what wishes do creators fulfill when they put witches on display? Right. So that seemed to be the kind of the framework for for what you're doing intellectually, academically. So if you could tell us more about how that determined what your choices were and all that.
Yes. So, this question of wishes that get fulfilled is trying to kind of get at let's be real, the voyeurism, the scopophilia that is part and parcel of why witches are such an omnipresent figure throughout any kind of media, but especially performance-based media, because witches, I think, also have a different relationship to the body and to other bodies. And part of what I set out to at first, the question was more about what wishes do witches fulfill by basically just sort of being a fantasy type of witch on stage. So at first I was thinking more of what I would call the superhero kind of witch, the kind of witch who's doing things that are, clearly fantasy-based magic. So the Wizard of Oz and that kind of a thing, even WandaVision. But then what I discovered that I wanted to really talk about were characters on stage who were witch characters that some people, again, might put in that fantasy realm, but that the more I did research, the more I thought to myself, no, this is an actual witch. This is someone practicing in magic that is, at least to my knowledge, associated with witchcraft. The thing that's tricky, as y'all I'm sure can appreciate, is that you can't just say that word witchcraft because it means so many different things to so many people. And one of the first things that I discovered was that, especially in academia, folks wanted me to give a very distinct kind of definition of witchcraft. And, that was tricky because I could talk about what it means for me, but I cannot talk about what it means for the world, and nor should I. It's a disservice to the power of witchcraft writ large. And I also think it's entirely possible that some of the folks that I think of through a witchy lens might not want to embrace that notion of witchcraft, right? They might call it something entirely different, brujeria, or something that is adjacent, but not witchcraft per se. Right. So about the wishes fulfilled by witches, ultimately became the division also of the chapter. So yes, it goes through casting a circle, but aligned with each one of those directions, I've also put a kind of skill or a wish that is fulfilled with witches being on stage. So flight is a big one, but also desire. So, questions of sexuality, but also questions of love magic and prophecy, possession, madness, which became sort of more of a time-shifting question, shape-shifting, and then ultimately glamour. So some of the top skills, I guess, that you can think of that witches put on stage.
So yeah, what I was really struck by in the book is just how often race comes into it, and just and gender identity and all kinds of ways of identifying and representation.
The reason I think that there's so much discussion about identity in the book is that in order to talk about witches on stage or on screen, we've got to actually think about the bodies that are presenting them, that are performing them. And that's a matter of representation. It's a matter of casting. And so the first chapter is about casting, both in terms of what you do for performance, but also in terms of the spells that witches cast. And it is, in fact, a spell that we cast when we put a particular actor in a particular role. It does something to how we understand that role, whether you're conscious of it or not. The human being who's embodying that role has a series of recognitions that go off in the audience's minds when we start to see that person enact that particular role. And so when it comes to witches in particular, I was especially keen to kind of zero in on, what kind of bodies do we tend to put on stage with particular kinds of witches? If you even think of it in terms of the maiden, mother, crone kind of archetype, who are the ones that we end up casting as crone? And why are those body types, those kinds of people always in that role? And why do we have these other kind of people who are always in this role of, maiden or mother? So.
Yeah, I thought about that when you were talking about when there was a black woman cast as Elphaba in Wicked, and it immediately made me think of Kat Graham in The Vampire Diaries, how she as a black actress was chosen to represent the whole notion of witchcraft in that show. Yeah, so that's a big theme of the book is that question of which witches are we which witches are which are we representing here?
One of the productions that I ended up reviewing, sort of, I guess it's towards the end of the book when I talk about Joanna Baillie's Witchcraft, in 1836 play. It's rarely produced, but it was done up in Canada. And the person who got to play my favorite role, which is Griselda Bain, it's an incredible role. You know, I thought was doing a fabulous job. I didn't get a chance to see it live. These are all just still photographs of the show. But part of what I found intriguing was the use of, I don't know, makeup that was somewhat Egyptian, somewhat Cleopatra-esque, and this person playing the role was a white blonde woman. It doesn't mean that, nobody's allowed to use winged eyeliner, but when it looks like the Eye of Horus, when it actually looks almost directly like something that is in fact a magical icon, is part of the history of Cleopatra, then it starts to be a little bit problematic. Because the other big thing is, certainly with the witch talk and all of the different kind of ways that witchcraft has come back into popular culture, is the question of appropriation, cultural appropriation. And that seems to be both at the same time something that the Generation Z students that I encounter are very aware of and want to avoid, and yet somehow continue to do over and over and over again. It's very odd because they will say it out of both sides of their mouths,
Yeah, what I find really interesting too about the book, the way that you go into it, is that it is also framed by the political conversation. And when we talk about just that juxtaposition where you're hearing the terms, partisan witch hunt,
Mhm.
and how often that term is being used, especially right now
Oh
with
yeah.
with Trump on trial and all that. But yeah, I think it's so important to put this in a political framework, because it is, to present a witch is a political act in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's
100%.
successful or not is another question, and that, I think, that comes up with like in your chapter on WandaVision.
Mhm.
But it's always a political act of some kind to do that. So yeah, I really appreciated that framework too.
Yes, and I think this notion of the witch hunt is so key, and may have been the I don't know, the fuel behind some of my need to get it published, right? I mean, part of it had to do with, there's so many people who are writing and talking about witchcraft right now, so it felt like the right time. But in addition, it just, every single time that I would open up any kind of socials and see any of the conservative kind of point of view trying to use the language of witch hunt to protect themselves, it's just so ludicrous and so frustrating that it feels that much more necessary to have witches' voices in the conversation, and not, the people who would have put us at the stake in the first place.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that becomes something that the students, when I teach the class, witches in pop culture, it's interesting because the one theme I can tell you that's come through, I think I've taught it 6 times now. And so it's about I don't know, hundreds of students who've gone through that class at this point. And the one theme that emerges is that most of them, 80 to 90% of them, didn't actually think witches or witchcraft was real. They didn't think it was anything other than just sort of the fantasy, whatever. And this is the part that really hurts my soul, but perhaps it's not surprising, they truly believed that they were connected to the devil, that they were somehow connected to evil. And, if there's nothing else that I do on this planet, if I can systematically help to dismantle those presumptions, then I'm at least, doing something.
Yeah, that's interesting because I taught a similar course here in Chicago, and clearly there students in Chicago are going to come from a slightly different demographic than Kansas.
Yeah.
So I didn't have a ton of people who believed in that satanic connection, but it was there, but mostly through pop culture.
Yeah.
So it was less so that they were taught from any kind of religious standpoint, but mostly just because of what's been drilled in, with pop culture.
Yeah.
So it's, wherever it comes from, it's still there. So that's it for us this episode. I want to thank Dr. Jane Barnette for joining us and having a lovely conversation about her book, once again, Witch Fulfillment, Adaptation, Dramaturgy, and Casting the Witch for Stage and Screen, and Routledge. Get your copy and get in on that conversation, especially if you have a more academic bent and want to see some of this stuff in its full academic glory. So once again, thanks for joining us, Jane. It's so great to see you.
Thank you. The book is wonderful. What he said, get it. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. It's really an honor to be here with y'all. Thank you.
So that's it for our show this time. Thanks for joining us, and thank you again to Jane Barnette, Dr. Jane Barnette of the University of Kansas, and our good friend. And hopefully you can check out that book at Routledge and dig into all that fun stuff. So yeah, what do we have coming up next time? Oh gosh, more interesting academia. Tell us about it.
I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite films of all time because it's, St. Patrick's Day and we have to celebrate all things Irish. We're going to be talking about Darby O'Gill and the Little People, one of my favorite films. We're going to have a special guest that is also a good friend of ours, Dr. Jenny Butler from University of Cork, I believe. And it's also one of their favorite films. So like this, if you haven't seen it, watch it and tune in for our next episode.
Yeah, it'll be our first international episode.
Yes.
Zooming in from Ireland. So there you go. Just to remind you, as usual, that we are we'll have some extra scenes on our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/popacultureshow, and to join us there as well. But if you're new to us here, please follow us, subscribe.
We really appreciate everybody's support. I just want to say this. I know it sounds a little, plastic fantastic, but like we wouldn't be doing it if people weren't watching. So I really appreciate all those comments that we get both on Facebook and YouTube and all the likes and follows and all of that. So thank you. And let's get to it.
All right. So we'll see you next time on the Pop Culture Show.
Thank you.